In 1911, a painting disappeared from the most closely watched wall in Paris, and no one noticed it for more than 24 hours. When the news became public, thousands of people stood in line just to look at the empty space where it had previously hung. That absence transformed a wooden panel, 77 by 53 centimeters, into the most famous object in the history of art. But the fame of the Mona Lisa is not explained solely by that theft. Behind the most studied smile on the planet, there are layers of paint invisible to the human eye, an identity that documentary science was only able to partially confirm 500 years later. Symbols that some researchers claim to see microscopically in the eyes, and at least one other version of the same portrait, painted by the same hand in a shared workshop. Florence, year 1503. Francesco del Giocondo, a prosperous silk merchant, commissions the portrait of his wife from a 50-year-old painter who already enjoys enormous prestige thanks to works such as The Last Supper. The commission follows a common custom among wealthy Florentine families: to commemorate the birth of a child or the acquisition of a new home through a domestic portrait. Nothing in that request anticipated that it would become the most reproduced work in history. Archival research carried out by the historian Giuseppe Palanti made it possible to reconstruct part of the link between both families. Francesco del Giocondo maintained contact, at least since 1497, with Piero da Vinci, Leonardo's notary father, and also with the Church of the Santissima Annunziata, where Leonardo himself had stayed upon returning to Florence in 1500. It is likely that this network of personal relationships, more than artistic prestige alone, explains why a middle-class merchant managed to get the most sought-after painter in the city to accept a relatively modest domestic commission by his usual standards. At that moment, Leonardo had just returned to Florence after almost 2 decades in the service of the court of Milan. He was working simultaneously on the mural of the Battle of Anghiari for the Florentine town hall and on a portrait of St. Anne, which makes Del Giocondo's commission one more among several projects open at the same time. This dispersion was not an exception in his career. Leonardo was known among his contemporaries for leaving works unfinished for years, as occurred with the Adoration of the Magi or St. Jerome in the Wilderness, both abandoned in intermediate states of execution. Leonardo da Vinci begins to work on the painting, but never delivers it to the family that had commissioned it. He takes it with him when he moves to Milan, then to Rome, and finally to France in 1516, invited by King Francis I, who offers him residence in the castle of Clos-Lucé near Amboise. There, in his last years of life, Leonardo continues retouching the painting. He dies in 1519 without ever having returned it to his original client. The biographer Giorgio Vasari, writing decades later, states that Leonardo devoted 4 years of work to the piece and still left it unfinished. That permanence of more than a decade in the hands of the artist himself, far from his patron, is the first fact that distinguishes this portrait from any other Renaissance commission. It ceased to be commissioned work and became a personal project that Leonardo was not willing to abandon. After his death, the panel passes into the hands of his disciple and heir, Gian Giacomo Caprotti, known as Salai. Eventually, King Francis I acquires it for the French royal collection. Thus, a painting conceived to decorate a merchant house in Florence ends up becoming property of the Crown of France, a fate that none of the original people involved could have foreseen. For 5 centuries, the identity of the woman in the portrait was a matter of debate. The most sustained hypothesis points to Lisa Gherardini, wife of Francesco del Giocondo, from which the Italian name of the work, La Gioconda, comes. This attribution was historically based on Vasari's testimony, written almost half a century after the events and therefore not entirely reliable as a direct source. The strongest documentary confirmation arrived only in 2005. The German historian Armin Schlechter located, in the library of the University of Heidelberg, a handwritten annotation in the margin of a book of letters by Cicero. The note, written in 1503 by Agostino Vespucci, an official of the Florentine Chancery and a close friend of Leonardo, compares the painter with the artist of antiquity Apelles and mentions that Leonardo was working on the portrait of the head of Lisa del Giocondo together with 2 other works, a portrait of St. Anne and the mural of the Battle of Anghiari. The Louvre itself then acknowledged that there was certainty about the fact that Leonardo was painting in 1503 a lady named Lisa del Giocondo, although it qualified that it could not be guaranteed with equal certainty that that painting was exactly the one that today hangs in its rooms. Vasari himself, the original source of the attribution to Lisa Gherardini, wrote his biography of Leonardo more than 30 years after the painter's death and never saw the work in person, since by then it was in France. That temporal and geographical distance explains why, over the centuries, the name Mona Lisa ended up associated with no fewer than 4 different paintings and more than 10 proposed identities for the model, as the historiography on the work has documented. Vespucci's 2005 note was the first evidence contemporary to 1503 that made it possible to drastically reduce that range of candidates. That distinction, subtle but relevant, left a door open that other researchers were quick to cross. Throughout the 20th and early 21st centuries, alternative theories emerged. One of them, proposed by the digital artist Lillian Schwartz in the 80s, maintains that the face of the Mona Lisa shares facial proportions with Leonardo's known self-portraits, which led her to speculate that the painting could contain features of the artist himself superimposed on those of the model. The hypothesis has no support among Renaissance historians, but it continues to circulate as one of the most cited readings of the enigma. Another line of thought, which goes back even to comments by Sigmund Freud at the beginning of the 20th century, links the expression of the portrait with a maternal memory of Leonardo tied to his biological mother, Caterina, a woman of humble origin about whom very little is known. This reading is purely speculative and lacks documentary support. The most controversial theory arrived in 2011 at the hands of the Italian researcher Silvano Vincetti, who maintained that the androgynous features of the face could correspond to a man, specifically Gian Giacomo Caprotti, the aforementioned Salai, Leonardo's disciple and companion for much of his adult life. Vincetti based his comparison on other drawings attributed to Leonardo's circle, such as the so-called angel incarnate, which presents a similar pose and smile. The academic community specialized in Leonardo largely rejects this hypothesis for lack of documentary support and because of the methodological limitations of comparing facial features between works of a different nature. There are also noble women candidates proposed at different moments of the 20th century, among them Isabella of Aragon, Duchess of Milan, Cecilia Gallerani, portrayed by Leonardo in The Lady with an Ermine, and Constanza d'Avalos, a Neapolitan noblewoman who, according to some chroniclers of the time, was also nicknamed La Gioconda because of her cheerful character. None of these attributions managed to prevail over the documentary evidence gathered around Lisa Gherardini, but their mere existence illustrates how disputed this point has been throughout the historiography of the painting. There is also a testimony that further complicates the picture. In 1517, Cardinal Luigi of Aragon visited Leonardo at his French residence in Amboise, accompanied by his secretary Antonio de Beatis, who left a written record of the encounter. According to that account, Leonardo himself showed him a portrait and described it as the image of a certain Florentine lady, painted on commission from Giuliano de' Medici, not from Francesco del Giocondo, which would suggest that the woman represented had been a lover of the Florentine nobleman rather than the wife of a silk merchant. This version is in direct contradiction with Vespucci's note and Vasari's account. To complicate the picture even further, the theorist Giovanni Paolo Lomazzo, in a text from 1584, refers separately to 2 works by Leonardo, one called La Gioconda and another called Mona Lisa, as if they were different paintings. Historians have not managed to definitively reconcile these contradictory testimonies, which leaves open the possibility, a minority one but not entirely ruled out, that there existed more than one portrait with an intertwined history that ended up merging into a single tradition. What is certain is that, despite the relative solidity of the identification with Lisa Gherardini, the painting never reached the hands of the family that had commissioned it. That fact, added to the absence of a contemporary inventory that precisely describes its final appearance, keeps the academic discussion open to this day. The most cited characteristic of the painting is also the most scientifically studied. Numerous visitors describe a particular sensation. The smile seems to fade when one looks directly at the mouth, but reappears when shifting one's gaze toward the eyes or toward another area of the face. Harvard neuroscientist Margaret Livingston offered an explanation based on the functioning of the human visual system. Central vision, the one used when staring fixedly at a point, processes in great detail but is less sensitive to contrasts of light and shadow. Peripheral vision, on the other hand, processes fine detail worse but captures variations of shadow and low spatial frequency patterns more effectively. The corners of the Mona Lisa's mouth are painted through soft tonal transitions without defined lines. When the eye rests directly on the mouth, central vision detects that ambiguity and the smile seems to weaken. When the gaze is directed to another part of the face, peripheral vision reinforces the reading of an upward curve in the corners and the smile seems to intensify. This ambiguity is not accidental. It is the direct result of the technique that Leonardo perfected throughout his career, known as sfumato, derived from the Italian verb sfumare, to evaporate like smoke. Instead of delimiting forms with precise contours, as was common in a large part of the painting of his time, Leonardo blurred the boundaries between light and shadow through superimposed, translucent layers. Applied to the corners of the lips, this technique eliminates the line that normally fixes an expression, leaving in its place an area of half-light interpretable in multiple ways depending on the angle and distance of observation. In 2005, a team from the University of Amsterdam, in collaboration with researchers from Illinois, applied emotion recognition software to a digital image of the face. The result, widely disseminated as a curiosity, yielded a reading of 83% happiness, 9% disgust, 6% fear, and 2% anger. More than a scientific revelation, the experiment functioned as a computational demonstration of something the human eye already perceived. The portrayed expression does not fit into a single defined emotional category. It should be noted that this ambiguity probably did not respond, in Leonardo's original intention, to a deliberate enigma. Formal portraits of the Quattrocento usually showed rigid faces, almost hieratic, typical of the social representation of status. Leonardo instead sought to capture a fleeting instant of natural expression, something unprecedented for portrait painting of his time. What is interpreted today as mystery may have been in its moment simply an unprecedented technical feat, painting not a pose, but a gesture about to change. Vasari himself, half a century later, described that effect of realism with a revealing detail. He claimed that in the eyes of the portrait, one could appreciate the same moist brightness that real eyes have, and that next to the throat, anyone who observed carefully could imagine the pulse beating beneath the painted skin. Beyond the obvious rhetorical exaggeration typical of laudatory biography, the comment confirms that already in the 16th century, Leonardo's contemporaries perceived in the work a degree of naturalism that far exceeded the standards of portrait painting of its time. Long before photography or cinema established new parameters of comparison for judging the realism of an image. Even the most technical aspect of this painting holds its mysteries. The physical support of the work is a poplar wood panel, a material prone to deforming with humidity and the passage of time. In fact, the panel developed a visible crack in its upper part, which led in the 1970s to reinforcing it with oak crosspieces that stabilize its structure without altering the painted surface. The technical analyses carried out by the Louvre laboratory, the C2RMF, through infrared reflectography and X-ray fluorescence, revealed a surprising fact about the technique employed. In certain areas, Leonardo applied up to 30 layers of oil varnish, each one thinner than a human hair. Between one layer and the next, a drying time of weeks, sometimes months, had to pass, which implies that the making of the painting required years of work for technical reasons alone, independently of compositional decisions. This procedure was not improvised. In his own notebooks, Leonardo developed in writing a theory about what he called aerial perspective, according to which colors and contours lose sharpness as distance and the intervening air increase, a principle he applied both to the landscape in the background, increasingly bluish and diffuse toward the horizon, and to the model's own face. Sfumato, in that sense, was not only an aesthetic decision about facial expression, but the systematic application of an optical theory that Leonardo had explicitly formulated before painting the work. That same search for scientific exactitude explains the anatomical precision of the hands crossed over the lap, considered by generations of later painters as a compulsory model of study. Leonardo had carried out, in parallel with his career as a painter, dozens of dissections of human corpses for purely anatomical purposes, documented in hundreds of drawings that detail muscles, tendons, and bones with a level of detail unprecedented for his time. That direct knowledge of the internal structure of the body, unusual even among the most recognized painters of the Renaissance, is what allowed him to represent the subtle muscular tension of hands at rest with a degree of realism that his contemporaries could not replicate solely from external observation of the model. Another curious finding is the fingerprints detected within the layers of paint, especially in areas of shadow such as the neck and the corners of the mouth. This indicates that Leonardo, in certain passages, dispensed with the brush and blended the pigment directly with his fingers, a practice consistent with the extreme softness that characterizes sfumato. The pigment analysis carried out by the Louvre laboratory identified a relatively limited palette by the standards of the time: earths and oxides for the skin tones, malachite and azurite for certain greens and blues of the landscape, and a vegetable black obtained from calcined bones used in the deepest shadows. No lapis lazuli was detected, the most expensive blue pigment of the Renaissance, which would indicate that Leonardo prioritized the subtlety of the modeling over the display of expensive materials, an unusual decision for a commissioned portrait in an era when the use of costly pigments was also usually a way of displaying the status of the client who paid for the work. Under magnification, much of the surface does not show identifiable individual brush strokes, which makes it enormously difficult to distinguish workshop copies from the original and fuels part of the debate over the authenticity of other versions of the painting. A detail that few visitors notice with the naked eye is the complete absence of eyebrows and eyelashes on the face. For a long time, this feature was attributed to an aesthetic fashion of the Florentine Renaissance, according to which women plucked their facial hair as a symbol of beauty. However, in 2007, Pascal Cotte presented a 240-megapixel image obtained with a camera of his own design and, after analyzing it for more than 3,000 hours, supported a different hypothesis. When closely observing the contour of the left eye, he identified an isolated stroke compatible with an eyebrow hair, as well as an area where the craquelure characteristic of old painting is anomalously interrupted. For Cotte, that interruption suggests that a restorer, at some point in the 5 centuries of the painting's history, cleaned that area with excessive vigor and accidentally removed eyebrows and eyelashes that had indeed originally been painted. The Louvre has not officially confirmed or ruled out this reading. The same 2007 study reported other differences between the current state of the painting and its digitally reconstructed original appearance. According to Cotte, the face would initially have been wider and the smile more expressive than the version preserved today. The skin showed a whiter tone before the darkening of the varnish, and the sky in the background, today a dull grey, would originally have been blue. He also detected that Leonardo modified the position of 2 fingers of the model's left hand during the painting process, and that over the shoulders one can distinguish the almost faded trace of a blanket or shawl that today is almost imperceptible. None of these changes is visible to a Louvre visitor observing the painting with the naked eye. All require imaging technology that did not exist until barely 2 decades ago. The hair also generated debate. For much of the 20th century, the idea circulated that the model's loose hairstyle without a headdress corresponded to the fashion associated in Renaissance Florence with women of licentious life, since married women usually covered or completely gathered their hair in public. Later studies with infrared reflectography determined that the hair does not fall completely loose, but is gathered at the back by means of a bun barely visible under the veil, which considerably weakened that reading and instead reinforced the association of the veil with the habitual clothing of a married or eventually pregnant woman of the Florentine bourgeoisie. Beyond identity and technique, a particular group of researchers has attempted to read the portrait as if it were a clinical history. According to a survey presented at the Public University of Navarre, over the years up to 44 different medical diagnoses have been proposed to explain different physical features visible in the painting, ranging from pregnancy and facial paralysis to hypothyroidism, alopecia caused by stress, and different neurological disorders, all of them based exclusively on the reading of the painted image and not on direct clinical evidence. The pregnancy hypothesis is one of the most recurrent. In 1959, the physician and historian Kenneth Keel identified in the painting several signs that he associated with hormonal changes typical of gestation. Among them, the position of the arms crossed over the lap and the veil covering the hair, a garment associated in 16th century Florence with pregnant women or women who had just given birth. Decades later, a Canadian team that analyzed the work with a three-dimensional laser scanner reached similar conclusions based on the same veil and the gathered hairstyle. Other specialists focused on the smile itself. Some doctors proposed that the asymmetry between both sides of the face could correspond to a partially recovered Bell's palsy, a condition of the facial nerve that can leave a slight contracture at the corner of the mouth as a sequela. A study published in the journal Current Cardiology Reviews, led by the Norwegian professor Leiv Ose, also observed a small yellowish accumulation of fat on the left eyelid, compatible with a xanthelasma, together with a possible lipoma on the back of the right hand. Both signs are usually associated with elevated cholesterol levels, which led the authors to speculate about a possible early case of familial hypercholesterolemia. Another reading focused on the neck, which some describe as slightly swollen, a possible sign of goiter or thyroid inflammation linked to the postpartum period. Those who defend this hypothesis point out that the feature would not be exclusive to the portrait. They documented a similar pattern in approximately 70 paintings and 10 sculptures from the same period and region, which suggests that, if it existed, the goiter would correspond to a relatively common condition in Renaissance Tuscany, probably associated with a diet with low iodine intake, rather than to a particularity exclusive to the model. None of these readings can be clinically confirmed. They are retrospective interpretations of a pictorial representation, not of a real body available for examination. This type of exercise is not exclusive to the Mona Lisa. The so-called paleopathology of art, a discipline that crosses art history and medicine, has produced similar retrospective diagnoses on dozens of Renaissance and Baroque portraits. But no other painting accumulated a comparable volume of medical proposals, which once again confirms that the level of scrutiny applied to this particular work far exceeds that of any other painting of its time. On August 21, 1911, Vincenzo Peruggia, an Italian worker who had been employed by the Louvre installing the protective display cases of several paintings, including the Mona Lisa, removed the painting from its frame, hid it under his clothing, and left the museum through a service door. The theft went unnoticed for more than a full day, since the staff assumed that the work had been temporarily removed to be photographed. The disappearance generated an unprecedented commotion. The museum closed for a week for the investigation, and when it reopened, thousands of visitors came solely to observe the empty space on the wall of the Salon Carré, still marked by the 4 metal hooks that had held the frame, a scene that in itself became an attraction as talked about as the painting had been until then. The French police interrogated dozens of employees, visitors, and usual suspects from the Parisian artistic milieu in an inquiry that today seems almost unbelievable. The poet Guillaume Apollinaire was briefly detained, and his friend Pablo Picasso was even interrogated because of an earlier and unrelated episode in which both had been linked to the purchase of antiquities stolen from the museum itself. Peruggia himself was interrogated in the first days after the theft, since he appeared on the list of former Louvre employees, but he was dismissed as a suspect without his home being searched. Peruggia kept the painting hidden in a double-bottomed trunk in his Parisian apartment for more than 2 years. In December 1913, he tried to sell it to the director of the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, alleging a patriotic motive: to return to Italy a Renaissance masterpiece that, as he mistakenly believed, had been looted by Napoleon. In reality, the painting had arrived in France legitimately centuries earlier, acquired by King Francis I during Leonardo's own lifetime. Peruggia was arrested, and the painting toured several Italian cities, Florence, Rome, and Milan, before enormous crowds, before returning to the Louvre in January 1914. The subsequent trial gave him a relatively light sentence, barely about 7 months in prison, partly due to the public sympathy generated by his supposed nationalist motive. Peruggia remained in France after his release, participated in the First World War, and continued working as a decorator and house painter, completely removed from the worldwide fame that his theft had generated around the painting. He died of a heart attack on October 8, 1925, the same day as his 44th birthday, in the French town of Saint-Maur-des-Fossés. His death passed almost unnoticed and only returned to the headlines by mistake 22 years later, when another person with the same name died. The real motive for the theft is not completely settled either. Although the official version maintains the patriotic explanation, an alternative story published in 1932 by an American journalist maintains that the operation had been orchestrated by a swindler known as Marquis Eduardo de Valfierno, who had commissioned a forger to make identical copies of the painting to sell them secretly to North American collectors as if they were the recently stolen original, taking advantage of the fact that none of those buyers could publicly report the purchase of a stolen work. According to this version, Perugia had been merely the material instrument of the theft, without knowing that it was a larger fraud, and Valfierno would never have contacted him again after the blow. Historians have not managed to independently verify the existence of Valfierno or the veracity of this account, which remains an alternative hypothesis, striking but unconfirmed about what happened in 1911. This episode is pointed out by art historians as the turning point that transformed the Mona Lisa from a masterpiece recognized within specialized circles into a phenomenon of worldwide fame. Newspapers across half the planet covered both the theft and the recovery, and printed reproductions of the painting multiplied as never before. In October 2004, with authorization from the Louvre, the French engineer Pascal Cotte, co-founder of the company Lumière Technology, scanned the painting with a multispectral camera of his own development, capable of capturing 13 different wavelength filters, from ultraviolet to infrared. The technique, baptized the layer amplification method, makes it possible to detect information invisible to the naked eye by projecting beams of intense light onto the surface and measuring their reflections. After more than a decade analyzing 3,200 resulting images, Cotte published in 2015 findings that generated wide repercussion. According to his interpretation, beneath the visible surface there are at least 4 different compositional stages, among them an earlier version with a different position of the head and a decorative detail in the hair, possibly a hairpin, absent in the final version. The scan also detected spolvero marks, a technique for transferring sketches by means of charcoal powder applied through small perforations in a preparatory drawing, visible along the hairline and the hand, which confirms that the final composition was not painted completely freehand, but over a previous scheme transferred to the panel. Cotte's most debated interpretation maintains that one of the deepest layers could correspond to a face with an orientation different from that of the final version, which he interpreted as evidence of a radically different compositional stage. Based on those data, Cotte came to publish a digital reconstruction of what, according to his reading, would have been the original appearance of Lisa Gherardini, with a hairstyle, clothing and head orientation different from those that were finally captured on the visible surface. The Louvre Museum systematically refused to comment publicly on these conclusions, and specialists in Leonardo's work question the methodology used to distinguish between real changes introduced by the artist himself, called pentimenti, and possible artifacts generated by the imaging technique used. The absence of an independent review by other laboratories with direct access to the original work keeps this reconstruction in the realm of unconfirmed hypothesis, even though its images have circulated widely as if it were a definitive finding. Beyond the specific controversy over these details, the underlying fact is less disputed among specialists. Leonardo substantially reworked the composition over the years instead of painting it all at once. This pattern of work is consistent with what is known of his usual method, also documented in other unfinished works or works subjected to multiple revisions, such as the Adoration of the Magi. In December 2010, the Italian researcher Silvano Vincetti, then president of Italy's National Committee for the Valorization of Historical and Cultural Heritage, announced a finding that traveled through the international press. Using high-resolution digitized images by Lumière Technology, and after a process of digitally eliminating reflections to isolate the color of the iris, his team claimed to have detected microscopic symbols painted in the model's eyes, visible only with a magnifying glass. According to Vincetti, the right eye contains the letter L, possibly the initial of Leonardo's own surname. In the left eye, a letter S could be distinguished, although the researcher himself acknowledged difficulties in specifying the stroke given the wear of almost 500 years. In addition, under the arch of the bridge that appears in the background of the landscape, his team identified what he interpreted as the number 72, although he admitted that it could also be an L followed by a 2. Vincetti linked that figure with numerological traditions present both in Jewish Kabbalah and in Christianity, where 7 is associated with the creation of the world and 2 with the duality between the masculine and the feminine. These claims have not been validated by the specialized academic community or by the Louvre's conservation team. Specialists point out that the natural craquelure of the painting, a product of the aging of the varnish and pigments, can generate patterns that the human mind interprets as recognizable forms, a phenomenon known as pareidolia, without there necessarily being any deliberate intention by the artist behind those forms. The background landscape itself constitutes another unresolved mystery. Different researchers have proposed concrete geographical identifications for the bridge that appears behind the figure. The Ponte Buriano, near Arezzo, is the most popularly publicized hypothesis in tourism, to the point that the nearby municipality periodically celebrates cultural activities around that association. In 2023, Vincetti himself presented new research pointing to a different bridge, known as Ponte Romito, or Bridge of the Valley, also in the province of Arezzo, after ruling out both the Buriano and the one in Bobbio for structural reasons. As he explained, the painted bridge rests on rocky walls, while both the Buriano, with 6 arches, and the one in Bobbio, with 7, are built on flat surfaces and do not match the number of arches visible in the painting. The Bobbio hypothesis, in the province of Piacenza, was developed for more than a decade by the art historian Carla Glory, who reached a considerably more radical conclusion than that of any other researcher. She maintained that the view would correspond to the so-called Hunchback Bridge, observed from the Malaspina dal Verme castle, and that the woman portrayed would not be Lisa Gherardini at all, but Bianca Giovanna Sforza, daughter of the Duke of Milan and wife of a nobleman linked to that fortress. In a version of the work that Glory dates to around 1496, several years before the Florentine Commission documented by Vespucci. The hypothesis has not been adopted by the academic community specialized in Leonardo, but it illustrates the extent to which the identity of the model and the geography of the landscape become intertwined in much of the alternative theories about the painting. Added to that geographical uncertainty is a compositional observation noted by several art historians. The background landscape doesn't respond to a single and coherent perspective. The horizon on the left side of the figure is visibly lower than that on the right side, as if both halves of the background had been painted from different points of view and then assembled behind the central figure. This discontinuity, far from being an oversight, is consistent with Leonardo's well-documented interest in geology and cartography. Studies of rock formations by him are preserved, as well as at least one topographic map of the Valdichiana region made for military purposes. Everything indicates that the landscape may have been constructed as a collage of real geological observations rather than as the faithful representation of a single identifiable place, which would explain why no candidate proposed so far manages to match the entirety of the scene exactly. The version known as the Isleworth Mona Lisa, property of the Mona Lisa Foundation based in Switzerland, represents a woman with similar features but apparently younger, with an unfinished background that includes 2 lateral columns. This detail is relevant because both a sketch attributed to Raphael and Vasari's description mention columns flanking the model, an element absent in the Louvre version, which some interpret as evidence that the original composition may have been cut down or modified at some point in its history. The painting was acquired in 1913 by an English collector who kept it in his residence in the London district of Isleworth, from which its current name comes, and then passed through several private owners before coming under the custody of the Swiss Foundation. Among those owners was the collector Henry Pulitzer, who in the 70s wrote an entire book dedicated to defending the authenticity of this version, eloquently titled "Where is the Mona Lisa?", in which he maintained that the Louvre work was in fact the late reworking of a portrait that Leonardo had begun years earlier and that ended up in private English hands. Its defenders maintain that it is an authentic work by Leonardo, painted before the Parisian version, possibly the original portrait commissioned by Francesco del Giocondo, while the Louvre one would represent a later and personal reworking by the artist. Most Leonardo specialists reject this attribution and classify it as a later copy or pastiche, not made by the master himself, although the debate over its origin remains without definitive resolution. Different is the case of the Mona Lisa of the Prado Museum in Madrid, considered for a long time a minor copy of little interest. Painted on a walnut panel, unlike the poplar used in the Louvre version, it was restored in 2012, which removed a layer of black background added later and revealed a landscape with rock formations that coincides in chromaticism and workmanship with the evanescent backgrounds characteristic of Leonardo, although it is not strictly identical to that of the Parisian work. A technical study through infrared reflectography also showed that this copy presents the same sequence of compositional changes, the same pentimenti as the original work, which strongly suggests that it was painted simultaneously in Leonardo's own workshop, probably by a disciple who observed the model in the same sessions as the master. This finding turned the Prado copy into an invaluable technical reference, since it preserved brighter colors without the progressive darkening that the varnish of the original suffered over the centuries, offering an approximation of how the work looked when newly finished. There are also dozens of additional historical copies catalogued in different European collections, a volume of reproduction that confirms the immediate fame that the composition achieved already in the Renaissance itself. Despite this multiplicity of versions, the panel preserved in the Louvre continues to be universally recognized as the autograph work of Leonardo da Vinci. The fame of the Mona Lisa was not built solely from academic art history. Much of its current status as a universal cultural symbol was forged in the 20th century through interventions that had little to do with the original painting. In 1919, the French artist Marcel Duchamp acquired a postcard with a reproduction of the painting and added a mustache and goatee to it in pencil, titling the piece with the initials LHOOQ, a phrase that, read aloud in French, sounds like a vulgar expression. The work became one of the most famous provocations of the Dadaist movement and established a precedent. From then on, the Mona Lisa became available as a surface for parody and constant reinterpretation. Decades later, in 1963, Andy Warhol incorporated the image of the painting into his series of pop silkscreens, repeating the face in grids as he did with figures such as Marilyn Monroe or Campbell's soup cans, thus equating the Renaissance painting with the icons of mass consumption of contemporary American culture. That operation consolidated the Mona Lisa as an almost endlessly reproducible object, present on T-shirts, mugs, advertisements, and magazine covers far beyond the museum circuit. Toward the end of the 20th century, different academic surveys counted that the composition had been cited or reinterpreted in more than 300 later pictorial works and in at least 2,000 different advertising pieces, a frequency of appearance that no other painting in the history of art has managed to equal. Popular interest received a new boost in 2003 with the publication of the novel The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown, which sold more than 80 million copies worldwide. The plot, entirely fictional in nature, proposed the existence of secret messages hidden in different works by Leonardo, including the Mona Lisa, and popularized among the general public the idea that the painter had left coded keys in his paintings. Although the book is a work of fiction without academic pretension, it contributed to installing in mass culture a conspiratorial framework of reading that, coincidentally, preceded Vincetti's announcements about hidden symbols in the eyes of the portrait by a few years, further fueling the public perception of the work as a coded riddle waiting to be solved. That same phenomenon of massive cultural appropriation had already manifested itself long before Duchamp and Warhol directly linked to the 1911 theft. The sudden celebrity of the painting inspired an opera premiered in 1915 titled precisely Mona Lisa, and two films from the early 30s centered on the episode of the theft. Decades later, in 1950, the singer Nat King Cole recorded a song titled Mona Lisa, which became one of the most successful songs of that decade and contributed to establishing the name of the painting as a recognizable cultural reference, even for those who had never set foot in a museum. This accumulation of references in music, cinema, opera, and literature ended up producing a feedback effect. Each new work inspired by the painting reinforced its status as an icon, which in turn fed interest in new reinterpretations. King Francis I acquired the painting for 4,000 gold florins, the equivalent of almost 14 kilos of the metal, and it is said that he initially kept it hanging in his own bathroom inside the castle of Fontainebleau, before incorporating it into the royal collection with greater formality. The operation was unusual by the standards of the time. Monarchs usually commissioned portraits of themselves or of their court, not acquire the image of the wife of a foreign merchant with no link to royalty, which confirms that by then the work had already ceased to be, in the eyes of Leonardo himself and those around him, a simple domestic commission, and had become a piece of personal artistic prestige for the painter. After the acquisition, the painting remained in different French royal residences, first in Fontainebleau itself and later in Versailles. With the French Revolution, the royal collection was nationalized and the work entered the Louvre in 1797. For a brief period at the beginning of the 19th century, Napoleon Bonaparte kept it hanging in his own bedroom in the Tuileries Palace, before it returned definitively to the museum's rooms. The 20th century brought several episodes of vandalism. In 1956, a visitor threw acid on the lower part of the painting, damaging the area and forcing a restoration. That same year, a separate incident with a stone caused a small loss of pigment near the left elbow, which accelerated the installation of protective glass. Decades later, in 1974, during a traveling exhibition in Tokyo, a woman tried to spray paint on the work, frustrated by the protective glass. In 2009, another visitor threw a ceramic cup against the glass, also without causing damage. The most recent episode occurred in 2022, when a climate activist disguised as an elderly woman in a wheelchair smeared cake on the protective glass as a form of environmental protest, generating wide media coverage without the work suffering any physical damage thanks precisely to the barrier installed decades earlier. Currently, the painting is exhibited in the Salle des États of the Louvre, inside an armored display case with humidity and temperature control, installed in its current version in 2005. It is the most visited individual work in the museum, with an estimated daily influx of around 30,000 people, which makes it a logistical bottleneck within a museum that received 8.7 million visitors in 2024, despite being a painting of relatively modest dimensions. In January 2025, French President Emmanuel Macron announced a renovation plan for the museum called the New Renaissance of the Louvre, which contemplates moving the work to an independent room with its own entrance to ease the flow of visitors. The project, with an estimated cost of up to €800 million, is expected to be completed in 2031. In December 1962, before traveling on loan to Washington and New York for a special exhibition, the painting was officially appraised at $100 million, a figure that the Guinness Book of Records continues to recognize as the highest insurance valuation ever assigned to a work of art, equivalent today to several $100 million adjusted for inflation. However, the policy was never actually taken out. The French authorities calculated that it was cheaper to directly finance an exceptional security device with armed escort and permanent surveillance throughout the tour than to pay the premium corresponding to such a valuation. That same logic of extreme security is maintained today in the Louvre, where the painting remains behind bulletproof glass inside a climate-controlled structure of several tons designed exclusively by the Italian company Goppian, specialized in high-security display cases for museums. That same company also built the display case that protects the British Crown Jewels in London. The structure that surrounds the painting today was updated in 2019 during a comprehensive renovation of the Salle des États, without the painting at any time leaving its maximum security conditions. The display case is designed to resist both physical attacks and variations in humidity that could damage the wooden panel. Despite this deployment, different studies on visitor behavior have documented that the average viewing time in front of the painting is barely between 15 and 30 seconds per person, most of it devoted to photographing the work rather than contemplating it, a striking contrast with the long lines and the several minutes of waiting involved in reaching the front of the room. 5 centuries of scientific, documentary, and technical analysis have not managed to completely close any of the great questions surrounding this work. The identity of the model today has a solid but not absolute documentary basis and still coexists with a 1517 testimony that openly contradicts it, as well as with minority hypotheses that propose completely different identities, such as Bianca Giovanna Sforza, in turn linked to alternative geographical landscapes. The real scope of the hidden layers detected through multispectral technology remains a subject of dispute among specialists. The supposed microscopic symbols in the eyes lack independent academic validation. The exact identity of the bridge in the background remains without consensus. partly because the landscape itself seems constructed from different geological fragments. The absence of eyebrows and eyelashes admits two equally plausible explanations and none confirmed. The dozens of medical diagnoses proposed for the face and hands of the model remain, at best, retrospective readings impossible to verify, and the relationship between the Louvre version and other period copies, especially the Isleworth one, continues to generate controversy among art historians. It is precisely this accumulation of partial uncertainties, rather than a single definitive secret, that keeps the Mona Lisa as an object of active research. Each new analysis technology, from infrared reflectography to the most recent multispectral systems, has added layers of information without fully resolving the central questions raised for 500 years. The next renovation of the Louvre, planned for 2031, will offer new viewing conditions for the public, but no change of room seems, for now, capable of settling any of the enigmas documented throughout this journey.